Many governments respond to rising debt burdens by raising taxes on income and wealth. With their net worths already eroding because of the bad economy and their failing investments, the wealthy desperately try to preserve their rapidly shrinking wealth at all costs. This leads to extremely high rates of tax evasion and increases the flight of capital abroad. This is typical in deleveragings. As growth weakens further, the lack of foreign lending shuts down an important source of credit creation. And while there is a lot of domestic credit creation and borrowing, this borrowing does not result in much growth because so much of it is spent abroad on foreign assets. Of the spending that does occur locally, much of it doesn't contribute to GDP. For example, investors buy lots of gold, factories, or imports, even rocks in the case of the Weimar Republic, as storeholds of wealth. Capital investments like machinery and tools are purchased as stores of value, not because they were needed. It's easy to see how these forces can create a feedback mechanism that causes inflation and currency declines to escalate until people completely lose faith in the currency. Money loses its role as a store of value, and people hold at most a few days' reserves. The long list of zeros also makes it an impossible unit of account. Money also breaks down as a medium of exchange, because the currency instability makes producers unwilling to sell their products for domestic currency, and producers often demand payment in foreign currencies or barter. Because there is a shortage of foreign exchange, illiquidity reaches its peak and demand collapses. This form of illiquidity can't be relieved by money printing. Stores close and unemployment rises. As the economy enters hyperinflation, it contracts rapidly because the currency declines that were once beneficial now just create chaos. In addition to causing an economic contraction, hyperinflation wipes out financial wealth as financial assets fail to keep pace with currency depreciation and inflation. Hyperinflation also causes extreme wealth redistributions. Lenders see their wealth get inflated away, as do debtors' liabilities. Economic contraction, extreme wealth redistributions, and chaos create political tensions and clashes. Frequently public servants like police officers go on strike because they don't want to work for worthless paper money. Disorder, crime, looting, and violence typically reach their peak during this phase. In Weimar Germany, the government had to respond to the disorder by issuing a state of siege, granting military authorities greater power over domestic policies such as carrying out arrests and breaking up demonstrations. Investing during a hyperinflation has a few basic principles: get short the currency, do whatever you can to get your money out of the country, buy commodities, and invest in commodity industries, like gold, coal, and metals. Buying equities is a mixed bag. Investing in the stock market becomes a losing proposition as inflation transitions to hyperinflation. Instead of there being a high correlation between the exchange rate and the price of shares, there is an increasing divergence between share prices and the exchange rate. So, during this time gold becomes the preferred asset to hold. Shares are a disaster even though they rise in local currency, and bonds are wiped out. Once an inflationary deleveraging spirals into hyperinflation, the currency never recovers its status as a storehold of wealth. Creating a new currency with very hard backing while phasing out the old currency is the classic path that countries follow in order to end inflationary deleveragings. Principles for navigating big debt crises. 61 War economies. War economies are totally different from regular economies in terms of what happens with the production, consumption, and accounting for goods, services, and financial assets. For example, the increasing GDP arising from the greater production of armaments which get destroyed in the war, the reduced unemployment rate due to increases in military service, shifts in production and profitability arising from the top-down allocation of resources, and the nature of borrowing, lending, and other capital flows are not the same as in periods of peace, so understanding these statistics requires a whole different orientation. Trying to adequately convey how war economies work would take a whole different book, so I'm not going to delve deeply into the subject now, but I will touch on them briefly because they certainly are important in understanding the big debt crises that were captured within our sampling period, and they are very important to understand if we enter another war period. The economic/geopolitical cycle of economic conflicts leading to military conflicts both within and between emerging powerful countries and established powerful countries is obvious to anyone who studies history. It's been well described by historians, though those historians typically have more of a geopolitical perspective and less of an economic/market perspective than I do. In either case, it is well recognized as classic by historians. The following sentence describes it as I see it in a nutshell: when 1. Within countries there are economic conflicts between the rich/capitalist/political right and the poor/proletariat/political left that lead to conflicts that result in populist, autocratic, nationalistic, and militaristic leaders coming to power, while at the same time, 2. Between countries there are conflicts arising among comparably strong economic and military powers, the relationships between economics and politics become especially intertwined and the probabilities of disruptive conflicts, example wars, become much higher than normal. In other words, economic rivalries within and between countries often lead to fighting in order to establish which entities are most powerful. In these periods, we have war economies, and after them, markets, economies, and geopolitics all experience the hangover effects. What happens during wars and as a result of wars have huge effects on which currencies, which debts, which equities, and which economies are worth what, and more profoundly, on the whole social political fabric. At the most big picture level, the periods of war are followed by periods of peace in which the dominant powers get to set the rules because no one can fight them. That continues until the cycle begins again, because of a rival power emerging. Appreciating this big economic/geopolitical cycle that drives the ascendancies and declines of empires and their reserve currencies requires taking a much longer, 250-year, time frame, which I will touch on briefly here and in more detail in a future report. Typically, though not always, at times of economic rivalry, emotions run high, firebrand populist leaders who prefer antagonistic paths are elected or come to power, and wars occur. However, that is not always the case. History has shown that through time, there are two broad types of relationships, and that what occurs depends on which type of relationship exists. The two types of relationships are a. Cooperative competitive relationships in which the parties take into consideration what's really important to the other and try to give it to them in exchange for what they most want. In this type of win-win relationship, there are often tough negotiations that are done with respect and consideration, like two friendly merchants in a bazaar or two friendly teams on the field. B. Mutually threatening relationships in which the parties think about how they can harm the other and exchange painful acts in the hope of forcing the other into a position of fear so that they will give in. In this type of lose-lose relationship, they interact through war rather than through negotiation. Either side can force the second path, threatening war, lose-lose, onto the other side, but it takes both sides to go down the cooperative, win-win path. Both sides will inevitably follow the same approach. Part 1. The archetypal big debt cycle 62 in the back of the minds of all parties, regardless of which path they choose, should be their relative powers. In the first case, each party should realize what the other could force on them and appreciate the quality of the exchange without getting too pushy, while in the second case, the parties should realize that power will be defined by the relative abilities of the parties to endure pain as much as their relative abilities to inflict it. When it isn't clear exactly how much power either side has to reward and punish the other side because there are many untested ways, the first path is the safer way. On the other hand, the second way will certainly make clear through the hell of war which party is dominant and which one will have to be submissive. That is why, after wars, there are typically extended periods of peace with the dominant country setting the rules and other countries following them for the time it takes for the cycle to happen all over again. In terms of economic policy, during a war period, the most important priority is to maintain one's access to financial and non-financial resources that are required to sustain a good war effort. Because no country has the capacity to both fund a war and sustain tolerable non-war-related spending out of current income, one must have access to borrowing and or have very large foreign exchange reserves. The access to borrowing very much depends on each county's creditworthiness and the development of its capital markets, especially the soundness of its own local currency debt market. Similarly, maintaining access to the critical non-financial resources that are required to sustain both the war effort and acceptable domestic economic conditions is essential during the war period. After the war period, during the paying back period, the market consequences of the debts and the outcome of the war, whether it is won or lost, will be enormous. The worst thing a country, hence a country's leader, could ever do is get into a lot of debt and lose a war because there is nothing more devastating. Above all else, don't do that. Look at what it meant for Germany after World War I in the 1920s, which is explained in Part 2, and for Germany and Japan after World War II in the late 1940s and the 1950s. The following charts show some of the typical shifts in the economy, how countries shift much of their economies to war production, borrow a lot of money to finance big fiscal deficits, and move much of their workforces to the armed services and war production. The first chart shows the rapid rise in government spending relative to private spending. The subsequent charts show the increase in military spending and the number of soldiers, averaging a number of war cases. Both military spending and number of soldiers as a percent of the population increase by around 5 times. For instance, during World War II, 20% of the U.S. workforce shifted to the military. 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, 100%, 0%, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, minus 12, 0, 12, 24, 36, 48, 60. Spending by sector, percent GDP. Federal government. Private sector government accounts for large share of total spending in wartime. Principles for navigating big debt crises. 63-12 0 12 24 36 48 60. Military personnel, percent pop, minus 12 0 12 24 36 48 60. Military spending, percent GDP, 0%, 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, 0%, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 25%, 30%. Big ramp up in size of military and thus big increase in military spending after a major war ends. All countries, both the winners and losers, are saddled with debt and the need to transition from a war economy to a more normal economy. The big contraction of military spending usually causes a post-war recession, as factories are retooled once again and the large number of people formerly employed in the war effort need to find new jobs. Countries typically enter periods of deleveraging, working through the big war debts with the same basic dynamics visible in other depressions/deleveragings coming into play here too. However, losers of war experience significantly worse economic conditions. The following charts demonstrate this dynamic. Losers experience a much deeper depression, resort to more money printing, meaningfully spend down their savings/reserves, and see much higher inflation rates, sometimes experiencing hyperinflation. Ination winners losers large wars both sides growth vs potential winners losers large wars both sides minus 12 0 12 24 36 48 6000 and 12 0 12 24 36 48 60 minus 25% minus 20% minus 15% minus 10% minus 5% 0% 5% 10% 15%. Economy generally runs hot early on then slows down. Losing side suffers deeper recession 0%, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 25%, 30%. Ination picks up on both sides early on, but diverges materially when losing side resorts to printing. Losing side resorts to significant money printing as situation becomes more dire. Money supply, percent GDP, winners losers large wars both sides fiscal balance, percent GDP, minus 12 0 12 24 36 48 60 minus 12 0 12 24 36 48 60 minus 35% minus 30% minus 25% minus 20% minus 15% minus 10% minus 5% 0% 5%. Governments run sizable school deficits to fund wartime spending 0% 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%. Part 1. The archetypal big debt cycle 64-12 0 12 24 36 48 60 reserves. USD, EST, indexed. Winners, losers, large wars, both sides 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130, 140. Central banks accumulate war chest of reserves. Losing side has to draw it down meaningfully. That's all I have to convey about war economies at this stage. For more color on them, I suggest you read the Weimar Germany and US Great Depression case studies in Part 2, as the first paints a good picture of a post-war period for a war loser and the second shows how economic conflicts initiate a sequence of events that lead to shooting wars. I also suggest that you also look at the charts of the US and UK in the post-World War II periods, two examples of winners of wars. The reasons we don't have charts for Germany, Japan, and other war losers for the post-World War II period is that the consequences for their currencies, other markets, and economies were so devastating that statistics were either ridiculously unreliable or unavailable. In summary, I want to reiterate my headline. Managing debt crises is all about spreading out the pain of the bad debts, and this can almost always be done well if one's debts are in one's own currency. The biggest risks are typically not from the debts themselves, but from the failure of policymakers to do the right things due to a lack of knowledge and/or lack of authority. If a nation's debts are in a foreign currency, much more difficult choices have to be made to handle the situation well, and, in any case, the consequences will be more painful. As I know from personal experience, the understandings and authorities of policymakers varies a lot across countries, which can lead to dramatically different outcomes, and they tend not to react forcefully enough until the crisis is extreme. Their authorities vary as a function of how powerful each country's regulatory and checks and balance systems are. In countries where these systems are strong, which brings lots of benefits, there is also the risk that some required policy moves can't get done because they are inconsistent with the rigid rules and agreements that are in place. It's impossible to write the rules well enough to anticipate all the possibilities, and even the most knowledgeable and empowered policymaker is unlikely to manage a crisis perfectly. Circumstances that weren't foreseen must be responded to instantly, often in hours, within a legal/regulatory system that doesn't have crystal clear rules. The checks and balances system, normally a critical protection from too much concentration of power, can exacerbate a crisis because it can slow decision-making and allow those with narrower interests to block necessary policy moves. Policymakers who try to take the necessary bold actions are typically criticized from all sides. Politics is horrendous during debt crises, and distortions and outright misinformation are pervasive. While these big debt crises can be devastating to some people and countries over the short to medium term, meaning 3 to 10 years, in the long run they fade in importance relative to productivity, which is more forceful, though less apparent because it is less volatile. The political consequences, example increases in populism, that result from these crises can be much more consequential than the debt crises themselves. The charts below show real GDP per capita and help to put these big debt crises, and the little ones that we call recessions, In perspective, the contractions of more than 3% are shown in the shaded areas. Note how the growth rates over time were. Principles for navigating big debt crises 65 far more important than the bumps along the way. The biggest bumps came more as a result of wars than the worst depressions, though a case can be made that those wars were caused by the political fallout from those depressions. 4.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 6.5, 7.0, 7.5, 8.0, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 24.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 6.5, 7.0, 7.5, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 20 USA Real GDP per capita, LN, GBR Real GDP per capita, LN, 4.0, 4.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 6.5, 7.0, 7.5, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 23.5, 4.0, 4.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 6.5, 7.0, 7.5, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 20 JPN Real GDP per capita, LN, DEU Real GDP per capita, LN, 1.0, 1.5, 2.0, 2.5, 3.0, 3.5, 4.0, 4.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 20, 1.0, 1.5, 2.0, 2.5, 3.0, 3.5, 4.0, 4.5, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 20 IND Real GDP per capita, LN, CHN Real GDP per capita, LN, 3.0, 3.5, 4.0, 4.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 20, 3.5, 4.0, 4.5, 5.0, 5.5, 6.0, 00, 20, 40, 60, 80, 00, 20 Rus Real GDP per capita, LN, BRZ Real GDP per capita, LN. Principles for navigating big debt crises 67 Disclosures Bridgewater Research utilizes data and information from public, private and internal sources, including data from actual Bridgewater trade sources include the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Asset International, Inc., Barclays Capital Inc., Bloomberg Finance LP, CBRE, Inc., CEIC Data Company Ltd., Consensus Economics Inc., CoreLogic, Inc., CoStar Realty Information, Inc., Credit Sites, Inc., Credit Market Analysis Ltd., Delogic LLC, DTCC Data Repository, US, LLC, EcoAnalytica, EPFR Global, Eurasia Group Ltd, European Money Markets Institute, EMI, FactSet Research Systems, Inc., The Financial Times Limited, Gave KAL Research Ltd, Global Financial Data, Inc., GuidePoint Global, LLC, Harvard Business Review, Haver Analytics, Inc., the Investment Funds Institute of Canada, Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, Investment Company Institute, International Energy Agency, Lombard Street Research, Market Economics Limited, Mergent Inc., Metals Focus Ltd., Moody's Analytics, Inc., MSCI, Inc., National Bureau of Economic Research, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Pensions and Investments Research Center, RealtyTrack, Inc., RP Data Ltd., Rystad Energy, Inc., S&P Global Market Intelligence Inc., Centex GmbH, Shanghai Wind Information Co., Ltd., Spears and Associates, Inc., State Street Bank and Trust Company, Sun Hung Kai Financial, UK, Limited, Thomson Reuters, Tokyo Stock Exchange, United Nations, US. Department of Commerce, Wood Mackenzie Limited, World Bureau of Metal Statistics, and World Economic Forum. While we consider information from external sources to be reliable, we do not assume responsibility for its accuracy. The views expressed herein are solely those of Bridgewater and are subject to change without notice. This material is for informational and educational purposes only and is not an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy the securities or other instruments mentioned. Any such offering will be made pursuant to a definitive offering memorandum. This material does not constitute a personal recommendation or take into account the particular investment objectives, financial situations, or needs of individual investors, which are necessary considerations before making any investment decision. Investors should consider whether any advice or recommendation in this research is suitable for their particular circumstances and, where appropriate, seek professional advice, including legal, tax, accounting, investment or other advice. The information provided herein is not intended to provide a sufficient basis on which to make an investment decision. This information is not directed at or intended for distribution to or use by any person or entity located in any jurisdiction where such distribution, publication, availability, or use would be contrary to applicable law or regulation, or which would subject Bridgewater to any registration or licensing requirements within such jurisdiction. No part of this material may be copied, photocopied, or duplicated in any form by any means, or 2. redistributed without the prior written consent of Bridgewater Registered Associates, LP. Copyright 2018 raydalio, all rights reserved. Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises Part 2, Detailed Case Studies. Table of Contents: German Debt Crisis and Hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924. 5 U.S. Debt Crisis and Adjustment, 1928 to 1937, 7 U.S. Debt Crisis and Adjustment, 2007 to 2011, 103. German Debt Crisis and Hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924. Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises. 7 German Debt Crisis and Hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924. This section provides a detailed account of the most iconic inflationary depression cycle in history, the German debt crisis and hyperinflation that followed the end of World War I and carried into the mid-1920s. Which set the stage for the economic and political changes of the 1930s. Much like my accounts of the 2008 U.S. financial crisis and the 1930s Great Depression, This study goes through the particulars of the case in some detail with reference to the template laid out earlier in the archetypal inflationary depression. Although the German hyperinflation took place almost a century ago, and amid exceptional political circumstances, Germany's defeat in the First World War and the imposition of a huge reparation burden on it by the Allies, the basic dynamic of debt cycles, economic activity, and markets described in the template drove what happened. Noting the differences between this inflationary depression case and other inflationary depression cases, and the deflationary depression cases highlights what makes some inflationary and others deflationary. To provide a vivid sense of what was happening in real time, a news feed runs along the sides of my description of what happened. July 1914 to November 1918, World War I. World War I, July 1914 to November 1918, set the stage for this big, dramatic cycle. During the war years, Germany left the gold standard, accumulated a large stock of domestic and foreign debts, began the practice of money printing to finance its ever-growing fiscal deficits, and experienced its first bout of currency depreciation and inflation. Based on their experience of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the Germans had expected the war to be short, and they assumed it would ultimately be paid for by large indemnities levied on the defeated Allied powers. Instead, it turned out to be an extremely long and expensive affair that was financed primarily through domestic debt, and Germany ended up having to pay a huge war reparation bill rather than collecting on one. This was a classic case of war debts being built up by a country that then loses the war, though more extreme than most, and is also a classic case of a country with large foreign currency denominated debt that is held by foreign creditors. Knowing the dynamic described in the archetypal inflationary depression section of Part 1, you should have a pretty good idea of how this story will play out. Background: like most countries at the time, Germany had been on the gold standard at the beginning of the war. All paper currency, including all government debt, was convertible to gold at a fixed rate. However, by 1914, the central bank did not have enough gold to back the stock of money in circulation at the fixed price one as one might expect. As soon as the war broke out, smart German citizens rushed to exchange their paper money for bullion, which caused a run on the banking system. Within a matter of weeks, the central bank, the Reichsbank, and the Treasury had paid out 195 million marks worth of gold to the public, i.e., about 10% of total gold reserves. Point 2. In order to prevent further losses, ensure liquidity in the banking system, and avoid a major contraction in the money. The news, July 29, 1914, Berlin. Very nervous. Big banks will support stocks keeping gold in vaults, although bankers insist that it is not justifiable to speak of a financial crisis in Germany. As a consequence of the danger of a general European war, conditions have undeniably grown graver in the last 24 hours. Runs on savings banks have increased in intensity, and the banks are paying out gold with the utmost reluctance. July 30, 1914, Berlin Bourse. On cash basis, gold has become scarce to the point of invisibility. The runs on Berlin savings banks are still going on. August 2, 1914 German bank rate up August 3, 1914 Reichsbank hoards gold. Patriotic appeal in Germany not to demand coin. Germany's financial and economic life are naturally greatly affected. The Reichsbank has raised the bank rate to 5% and the Lombard rate to 6%. The demand for gold continues, but up to the present time the Reichsbank has paid out comparatively little of it. August 12, 1914 German banks helped. Financing of the mobilization has been successful. March 4, 1915 German loan in Chicago. Bankers ask for subscriptions. First offering by belligerents. March 10, 1915 No gold in German banks. Patriots urged to exchange hoarded gold for war loan stock. April 10, 1915 Germany faces huge debt, means $500 million a year and doubling of taxes. The socialist newspaper Vorwärts, discussing the new war budget, calculates that interest on war loans, deficit for war years, and the making good after the war will mean doubling all existing taxation. The annual increase of expenditure is figured at $625 million to $730,000,000. All news excerpts from the New York Times. Part 2. German Debt Crisis and Hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924. 8. Supply. Policymakers suspended the conversion of money to gold on July 31, 1914.3. The government also authorized the Reichsbank to buy short-term treasury bills and use them, along with commercial bills, as collateral for the money it was printing. 4. The pace of printing that followed was rapid. By the end of August, the quantity of Reichsbank notes in circulation, i.e., paper marks, had increased by approximately 30%. 0.9, 1.1, 1.3, 1.5, 1.7, 1.9, 1912, 1913, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917. Price of gold in marks. This is classic. Currency is both a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. When investors hold a lot of promises to deliver currency, i.e., a lot of debt denominated in a currency, and the supply of that currency is tied to something that backs it, the ability of the central bank to produce currency is limited. When investors want to convert their bonds to currency/money and spend it, that puts the central bank in the difficult position of having to choose between having a lot of debt defaults or floating a lot of currency, which can debase its value. So, whenever the amount of money in circulation is much greater than the amount of gold held in reserves to back the money at the designated price of conversion, and b. investors are rushing to convert money into gold because they are worried about the value of their money, the central bank is in the untenable position of either reducing the supply of money in circulation, i.e., tighten credit, or ending convertibility and printing more money. Central banks almost always choose suspending convertibility and printing more money versus allowing a credit contraction to take place, because it's less painful. Printing a lot of money and depreciating the value of a currency causes just about anything denominated in that depreciated money to go up in price, and people like it when the things they own go up in value and they have more money to spend. This is also true in times of war. Policymakers attempting to marshal the economic resources of the country toward the war effort print money to give themselves more to spend. This printing helps prevent a liquidity crisis in the banking system or an economic contraction from taking place, either of which would be very disruptive to the war effort. It is for this reason that most of the countries fighting in WWI ended up suspending the gold standard at one point or another. Fighting the war required the German government to significantly increase expenditures. Government spending as a share of GDP would increase 2.5x between 1914 and 1917. Financing this spending would mean either raising new revenues, i.e., taxation, or increasing government borrowing. As there was huge resistance to increasing taxation at home, and as Germany, the new September 22, 1915 Berliners buy war bonds, rush for subscriptions to Third German loan reported March 12, 1916 German food crisis seems impending. Newspapers just received from Germany contain many semi-official and seemingly inspired articles emphasizing the economic difficulties due to the Allies' blockade and the failure of the 1915 crop. March 19, 1916 $10,400,000 for German war loan. October 9, 1916 Fifth German loan $10,590,000,000 marks. Berlin, announcing total, says subscriptions have exceeded the amount expected. February 24, 1917 German Reichstag votes 15 billion marks. A new war credit of 15 billion marks was introduced in the Reichstag today. This credit of 15 billion marks brings the total credit in Germany up to 67 billion marks, or, on the basis of values before the war, $16,750,000,000. May 21, 1917 Germany to borrow bonds. The Exchange Telegraph's Amsterdam correspondent quotes the Berliner Tageblatt as saying that Germany's finance ministry, as a preliminary step to new methods of raising money, intends to call in all Swedish, Danish, and Swiss bonds and shares owned by Germans. July 9, 1917 German Finance Saturday's cablegrams brought the result of the 6th German loan and the announcement of the 9th German credit. The latest loan produced 13,120,000,000 marks. September 12, 1917 Germany keeps coal from Holland to force loan. Germany is employing this method with a view to exerting pressure in order to induce Holland to fall in with the German desire to raise a loan here. It will be recalled that Germany put similar pressure on Switzerland a short time ago. November 18, 1917 latest German loan was uphill fight. Every power of persuasion and pressure at the disposition of the German government was brought into play to make a success of the 7th war loan of 15 billion marks, $3,570,000,000 at normal exchange, according to reports found in German newspapers recently reaching London. Principles for navigating big debt crises. 9 was mostly locked out of international lending markets. The war had to be financed by issuing domestic debt. 5 In 1914, German government debt was insignificant. By 1918, Germany had amassed a total local currency debt stock of 100 billion marks, about 130% of German GDP. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 EST government budget surplus/deficit, percent GDP, Government debt, Mark BLN, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, -60%, -50%, -40%, -30%, -20%, -10%, 0%, 10%, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120 Source, Global Financial Data. Although the stock of debt was huge, prior to the German surrender and the imposition of war reparations, most of it was denominated in local currency. 6 Policymakers recognized that this was a good thing. According to the Reichsbank, the greatest weakness in the war financing of the enemies is their growing indebtedness abroad, particularly to the US. 7 As it forces them to scramble for dollars when needing to make debt service payments. In contrast, most German debt taken on to finance the war, prior to reparations, was in local currency and financed by Germans. 8 Up until the second half of 1916, the German public was both willing and able to finance the entire fiscal deficit by purchasing government debt. 9 In fact, war bond issuances were regularly oversubscribed. However, as the war dragged on and inflation accelerated, the Treasury found that the public was no longer prepared to hold all the debt it was issuing. This was partly due to the size of the deficit, increasing substantially as the war progressed, but also because wartime inflation had caused real interest rates to become very negative. Government war bonds paid out a fixed interest rate of 5% throughout the war, whereas inflation had climbed above 30% by early 1915. Which resulted in lenders not being adequately compensated for holding government debt. 10 The inflation was being driven by wartime disruptions and shortages, capacity constraints in key war industries, and currency weakness. The mark would fall about 25% against the dollar by 1916. 11 While some naive lenders clung to the hope that the government would return to the gold standard at the old exchange rate once the war was over, or compensate them for any losses due to inflation, others feared they would most likely be paid in money that had lost most of its purchasing power, so they ran out of debt denominated in that currency. 12 The News, January 16, 1918 Berlin food scarcer, population forced to keep to the ration quantity. The population is compelled to exist almost entirely on the rationed quantities of bread, meat, and potatoes. February 18, 1918 New taxes in Germany to meet big deficit. Dispatches received from Berlin say that the ordinary receipts and expenditures of the German budget for 1918 balance at 7,332,000,000 marks, as compared with approximately 5 billion marks last year. The increase is said to be due mainly to the higher amount required for interest on the national debt. March 13, 1918 Germany seeks new loan. A new German war loan of 15 billion marks will be issued soon, an exchange telegraph dispatch from Copenhagen says. The German war debt now amounts to 109 billion marks. April 21, 1918 German loan passes 3 billion mark. May 21, 1918 German exchange falling. Germany, judging by foreign exchange rates, has no prospect of smashing the opposition on the West Front. June 13, 1918 German loan 15,1,425,000 marks. Subscriptions from the army to the 8th German war loan brought the total of the loan up to 15,1,425,000 marks, according to Berlin Dispatches today. October 27, 1918 debts now exceed assets. Germany's financial status as shown in recent figures. October 27, 1918 financiers foresee crash. Long known here that Germany was approaching economic abyss. November 7, 1918 Germany's finances near breaking point, debt exceeding $35 billion. Has mortgaged 2/5 of her national wealth. November 11, 1918 armistice signed, end of the war. Berlin seized by revolutionists, new chancellor begs for order, ousted Kaiser flees to Holland. Part 2, German debt crisis and hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924. 10% 20% 40% 60% 80% 100% 120% 140% 160% 180% 2H 1914 1H 1915 2H 1915 1H 1916 2H 1916 1H 1917 2H 1917 1H 1918 2H 1918 Oversubscribed Undersubscribed German public subscription for war bonds, percent issuance. The currency remained an effective medium of exchange while losing its effectiveness as a storehold of wealth. So, the government borrowed money to pay for its war expenditures, and the Reichsbank was forced to monetize the debt as investors came up short in supplying the money. This had the effect of increasing the money supply by an amount equal to the fiscal deficit not financed by the public. As debt monetization is inflationary, there is more money in the economy chasing the same quantity of goods and services. A self-reinforcing spiral ensued, i.e., debt monetization increased inflation, which reduced real interest rates, which discouraged lending to the government, which encouraged additional debt monetization. As the deficit was huge, averaging about 40% of GDP between 1914 and 1918, this led to the money supply increasing by almost 300% over the course of the war. 13 The pace of money creation accelerated after 1917 as German citizens became increasingly unwilling to purchase government debt, and the central bank was forced to monetize a growing share of the deficit. 14 Although the number of marks in circulation almost doubled between mid-1917 and mid-1918, it did not cause a material decline in the currency. In fact, the mark rallied over this period as Russia's withdrawal increased expectations of a German victory. The mark only began falling in the second half of 1918, as a German defeat began looking increasingly likely. 15 Source: Global Financial Data 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 Marks in circulation, BLN. Mark exchange rate vs USD. In the last 2 years of the war, the German government began borrowing in foreign currencies because lenders were unwilling to take promises to pay in marks. 16 When a country has to borrow in a foreign currency, it's a bad sign. By 1918, The Reichsbank and private firms each owed about 2.5 billion gold marks in FX to external lenders. 17 A gold mark was an artificial unit used to measure the value of a paper mark to gold. In 1914, 1 gold mark equaled 1 paper mark. 18 A debt of 5 billion gold marks was therefore a debt denominated in gold, with the bill equal to the amount of gold that could be purchased by 5 billion marks in 1914. Unlike local currency debt, hard currency, foreign currency and gold-denominated debt cannot be printed away. Debtors would have to get their hands on either gold or foreign exchange to meet these liabilities. While the hard currency debt was less than 10% of the total debt stock, it was still larger than the entire public gold. Principles for navigating big debt crises. 11 Reserves of the Reich. 19 The hope was that once Germany won the war, the mark would appreciate, making those debt burdens more manageable. And, of course, the losing countries would be forced to pay for most of Germany's foreign and domestic debts. 20 Policy makers recognized that if Germany lost the war, or failed to extract large reparations, it would be extremely difficult to pay back these debts with hard money. According to the president of the Reichsbank, Rudolf Havenstein, covering those debts will be extraordinarily difficult if we do not get a large war indemnity. 21 According to the German economist Edgar Jaffe, unless England paid between a third and a half of Germany's war costs, the result would be the monstrous catastrophe of currency collapse once German citizens learned that domestic debts would likely be paid in depreciated money, and government agencies and private firms scrambled to get their hands on foreign exchange to pay off external liabilities. 22 Breaking the peg to gold and monetizing an ever-growing fiscal deficit, combined with wartime economic disruptions and shortages, led to a declining exchange rate and a pickup in inflation. By the beginning of 1918, the mark had lost about 25% of its value versus the dollar and prices had tripled. However, in the context of WWI, this was pretty typical, i.e., it's what most countries did to fund their wars. German inflation, while high, was not significantly higher than that of other war participants, as you can see in the chart below. 23 But only a few of the war's many participants ended up with hyperinflation, for reasons I will soon explain. In Asian, Y/Y, do USA GBR minus 10%, 0%, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%, 1914, 1915, 1916, 1917, 1918. I bring up this point to underline the fact that WWI, and the accompanying monetization of debt, did not directly cause Germany's post-war inflationary depression. As mentioned in the archetype template, while inflationary depressions are possible in all countries/currencies, they are most common in countries that don't have a reserve currency, so there is not a global bias to hold their currency/debt as a storehold of wealth, have low foreign exchange reserves, so there is not much of a cushion to protect against capital outflows, have a large stock of foreign debt, so there is a vulnerability to the cost of debt rising via increases in either interest rates or the value of the currency the debtor has to deliver, or a shortage of available credit denominated in that currency, have a large and increasing budget and/or current account deficit, so there is a need to borrow or print money to fund the deficits have negative real interest rates, so lenders are not adequately compensated for holding the currency/debt have a history of high inflation and negative total returns in the currency, so there is a lack of trust in the value of the currency/debt. By the end of the war, the German economy met all of these conditions. Losing the war meant that the mark was not going to be the reserve currency of the post-war era. A large stock of external debts had been. Part 2, German Debt Crisis and Hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924, 12 acquired, and it was very likely that the Allies would force Germany to pay them an additional sum in war reparations. Foreign exchange reserves were not sufficient to meet the existing stock of external debts, let alone any additional reparation payments. Real interest rates were very negative, and offered little compensation to creditors holding German currency/debt. The budget and the trade balance were also in very large deficits, meaning that Germany would remain dependent on borrowing/monetization to finance expenditures and consumption. Finally, the experience of high inflation, money printing, and negative total returns in holding the mark had begun to reduce trust in the German currency/debt as a storehold of value. November 1918 to March 1920, the Treaty of Versailles and the first inflation news of the German surrender in November 1918 was met with a wave of capital flight out of Germany. German citizens and firms rushed to convert their wealth into the currencies and assets of the victorious powers, not knowing what the terms of the peace would be or exactly how the German government would pay for its massive stock of liabilities now that it had lost the war. Over the next few months, the mark declined about 30% against the dollar, the German stock market lost almost half its real value, and government debt in local currency rose by about 30%. Almost all of which had to be monetized by the central bank. As a result, the money supply grew by about 50% and the inflation rate climbed to 30%. Minus 10%, 0%, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 mark exchange rate vs USD in nation, Y/Y, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 05, 10, 15, 20 source. Global financial data. This capital flight occurred despite initial optimism that the final terms of the peace would not be particularly harsh. Many members of the German negotiation team hoped that reparations would be limited to damage done in territories occupied by German forces, and would be paid primarily in goods instead of currency. 24 U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's emphasis on self-determination also led many Germans to believe that there would be no annexations of German territory without at least a referendum. Many Germans therefore expected that their country would come out of the war with its territory and economic capacity intact, and that the reparation burden would not be too vindictive. 25 When the final terms of the Treaty of Versailles were revealed, they came as a huge shock. Germany was to lose 12% of its territory through the news. November 12, 1918 revolt still spreads throughout Germany. November 23, 1918 Ebert and Hausse deny banks will be seized, uphold the war loans. 4 weeks, even before the revolution, there had been a steady run on German banks all over the country, not only causing an extremely painful dearth of currency, but the banks in many cities, among them Berlin, being compelled to print so-called Notgeld. November 27, 1918 Firm for forcing Germans to repay. Allies may occupy the former empire if attempt is made to escape reparation. November 30, 1918 High mortality in Berlin, 15,397 more deaths than births among civilians last year. May 1, 1919 Germans confident of swaying Allies. May 1, 1919 Germany to lose 70% of iron and 1/3 of her coal. June 2, 1919 What comes next? Worries Germans. Allied hostility to the counter-proposals causes much pessimism. What is going to happen now? That is the question everyone is asking here, and now that the almost unanimously hostile attitude of the Entente press toward the German counter-proposals is known, the answer is a very pessimistic one. June 6, 1919 Germans smuggle wealth abroad. Some merely wish to escape the inevitably heavy taxation which must be shortly expected. The government will not allow cash to be sent out of the country, so the merchants smuggle their marks abroad and sell them at a large reduction, thereby still further reducing the value of the mark. June 8, 1919 If Germany doesn't sign starvation, Allies are ready to enforce a blockade more rigorous than ever before, should enemy balk at peace terms. June 15, 1919 sees Germans tax $75 each a year. Minister Wissel doubts wisdom of importing food to be paid for in blood. June 28, 1919 Germans reach Versailles. Treaty to be signed today. Principles for navigating big debt crises. 13 annexations, 10% of its population, 43% of its pig iron capacity, and 38% of its steel capacity. 26 Germany was also required to compensate Allied citizens for all wealth seized during the war, within Germany and in occupied territories, but it would receive no compensation for its own assets, both real and financial, that had been confiscated abroad. The German government would also have to honor all pre-war debts to Allied creditors, even if they were the debts of private citizens. As for reparations, a commission was to be established in 1921 that would determine the final bill after evaluating Germany's capacity to pay and giving its government another chance to be heard on the subject. In the interim, Germany would pay an equivalent of 20 billion marks in gold, commodities, ships, securities, and other real assets to compensate the Allies for the costs of occupation. 27 Germany had no option but to agree to these terms or face total occupation. It signed the treaty on June 28, 1919. This triggered another sharp plunge in the exchange rate. 28 with the mark falling 90% against the dollar between July 1919 and January 1920. Inflation surged, hitting 140% by the end of the year. Once again, the mark's drop was driven primarily by German citizens rushing to get their capital out of the country because they justifiably feared that these promises to deliver currency, i.e., these debt obligations, would make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the German government to meet its liabilities with hard money. To do that, the Reich would have to levy extortionately high taxes and confiscate private wealth. as the real wealth of private citizens was at risk. Getting out of the currency and the country made sense. 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, minus 10%, 40%, 90%, 140%, 190%, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Mark exchange rate vs USD in Asian, Y/Y, as the mark fell. German debtors with external liabilities saw the real expenses of their debts soar. They rushed to pay off as many of their foreign debts as they could, flooding the foreign exchange market. This further weakened the mark, triggering additional rounds of capital flight. This dynamic is also very common in countries with large foreign currency denominated debt during a debt/balance of payments crisis. As a prominent Hamburg industrialist noted at the time, "We are driving ourselves to destruction if everyone now secretly sells marked notes in order to be able to meet his obligations. If things keep on this way, the marked notes will become unusable." 29. To be clear, at this point money printing was not the source of the currency weakness so much as currency weakness was the cause of money printing. In other words, capital flight from the currency and the country was driving the currency down, which in turn helped drive higher inflation. That's classically how inflationary depressions happen. The news August 3, 1919 German resources are in Allies' grip. August 9, 1919 Germans approve centralized plan of finance minister. This decision, which approves the Erdberger plan of unified imperial taxes, removes the rights of states to impose taxes and was bitterly contested. August 10, 1919 mark goes still lower. German marks, the value of which has been steadily falling recently in neutral countries surrounding Germany, reached their lowest point in history in Switzerland yesterday, being quoted at 35 centimes instead of the peace price of 125 centimes. August 11, 1919 billions in paper in Deutsche Bank, but report admits big figures don't mean real gain in German business. The management remarks, "It is true that the uncanny rise in the cost of operation is due to the depreciation of our money standard, but it is also materially due to the demand of the personnel in connection with decreased labor output and shorter working day." September 7, 1919 rigor in German tax hunt, agents empowered to search houses and force strong boxes. September 13, 1919 German industry rapidly reviving. British observer says progress is greater than in any other country. September 18, 1919 mark touches lowest point in the history of Germany. Matthias Erdberger, Minister of Finance, today convened a conference of bankers and other financiers in order to discuss the decreased value of the mark and other financial problems. September 26, 1919 Germans in discord over heavy taxes. Erdberger hints at resignation of the government if opposition is pressed. October 20, 1919 German steel output up, figures for July show big gain during the last few months. November 15, 1919 won't take German money, Hanover tradesmen refuse cash bought at low exchange rates. A large number of Hanover tradesmen have decided to sell nothing to foreigners who wish to pay in German money which they bought with foreign money at the present low rates of exchange. Foreign money will, however, be accepted at the ordinary peacetime rates. Part 2. German Debt Crisis and Hyperinflation, 1918 to 1924. 14. Naturally, as money leaves a currency/debt market, that puts the central bank in the position of having to choose between A, allowing the liquidity and debt markets to tighten up a lot, and B, printing money to fill in the void. Central banks typically print money to fill the void, which causes currencies to decline. While currency declines hurt importers and those with debts in foreign currencies, devaluations are stimulative for the economy and its asset markets, which is helpful during a period of economic weakness. Currency declines provide a boost to exports and profit margins, as they make a country's goods cheaper on international markets. Simultaneously, they make imports more expensive, supporting domestic industries. Devaluations also cause assets to rise in value when measured in local currency, and they attract capital from abroad as a country's financial assets become cheaper in global currency terms. From July 1919 through March 1920, the decline in the mark and negative real rates provided a boost to the German economy and its equity and commodity markets. 0.25 0.50 0.75 18 19 20 0.50 100 150 200 250 18 19 20 Nominal equity prices Commodity price index, marks. The export industry also thrived, unemployment declined, and as real wages remained low, business profitability improved. You can see the decline in unemployment and the pickup in exports in the charts below. Note that all unemployment statistics from the time only show unemployment among trade union members, so they likely understate the true amount of unemployment and hardship in German society. However, they do show that employment conditions were improving. 0%, 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 18, 19, 20, 0, 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 18, 19, 20. Unemployment of union members estimated exports, gold marks MLN. There was also the hope that by encouraging exports and discouraging imports, the mark's decline would be a one-off and would help bring the German balance of payments into equilibrium. According to one prominent German official, the news November 29, 1919 good market here for German bonds, imperial war loans and securities of cities attractive to American speculators. December 1, 1919 Germany checks exports lest country be stripped. The government's alarm over the manner in which the process of selling out Germany continues has finally forced it to enact temporary measures which are calculated to put a radical check on exports. December 5, 1919 Erdberger offers great tax budget, 60% levy on biggest incomes in Germany's post-war financing. Discussing Germany's post-war economic obligations, Herr Erdberger said that the problems confronting the nation demanded the same universal solidarity among all citizens as did the responsibilities during the war. He hoped that the prospective tax reports would accelerate progress toward democracy, and contribute to the raising of a new Germany on the ruins of war. December 17, 1919 Germany's loan falls far short, only 3,800,000,000 marks subscribed, instead of 5 billion which were expected. The government is greatly disappointed by the failure of the premium bond loan, for the preliminary figures show that it can hardly be represented as anything like the success which Erdberger and his colleagues expected. January 2, 1920, Berlin Bourse becomes lively on expectations of treaty. This was due chiefly to the understanding Germany had reached with the Entente with regard to the signing of the peace treaty and the expectation of better conditions for exports and imports. January 23, 1920, Erdberger serene facing many foes. January 26, 1920, Germans begin evacuating lands lost by treaty. German preparations for the evacuation of Danzig, which is to become a free city under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, had as one feature a final parade of the German troops this morning. Principles for navigating big debt crises. 15. I regard our gravely ailing currency as an admirable means of dispelling the hatred felt abroad towards Germany, and of overcoming the reluctance to trade with us by our enemies. The American who no longer gets for his $4.21 marks worth of goods from us, but 6.20 marks worth, will rediscover his fondness for Germany. 30. German policymakers also began considering ways to deal with the domestic debt burden and the fiscal deficit. As one official described policy since the end of the war, all we have done is keep printing 31 to reduce the deficit, and raise revenues to meet debt liabilities. A comprehensive tax reform package was proposed by Finance Minister Matthias Erdberger. Known as the Erdberger Financial Reform, the package would transfer from the haves to the have-nots by levying highly progressive taxes on income and wealth, with top rates for income approaching 60%, and those for wealth at 65%. 32 passed in December 1919. The Erdberger reforms would go on to increase the share of the Reich's income coming from direct taxes to 75%. The 1914 figure had been about 15%, and raise enough revenue to pay for all government expenditures except reparations by 1922.33. Prior to these reforms, the majority of the government revenue came from public enterprises, primarily railroads, as well as specific duties on exports, imports, and coal. The beneficial results of currency weakness led many German policymakers to advocate relying on currency weakness and inflation, from rising import prices and central bank printing, as an effective alternative to confiscatory taxation. 34. One such official was Dr. Friedrich Bendixen, who argued that every effort to collect the monstrous sum through taxes will weaken our productivity and thus reduce receipts and drive the right to economic collapse. Only the transformation of the war loans into money can bring salvation. 35. Inflation would cleanse Germany of its local currency war debts and allow it to begin a new life on the basis of new money. Although this program was explicitly rejected by the central bank, it recognized that things might develop along these lines anyway. They did. Inflation climbed to almost 200%, and by the end of 1919 it had reduced the domestic war debt burden to about 25% of its original 1918 value. As you might imagine, those with wealth scrambled to buy foreign currencies or real assets to prevent their wealth from being either inflated or taken away. 36. Real local currency debt. 1913 marks BLN, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 Jan 19 APR 19 Joule 19 Oct 19 Jan 20 The central bank's alternative to allowing inflation to naturally reduce the real debt burden was to tighten monetary policy, and the news January 31st, 1920 Gold and silver bring high prices in Berlin. Germans pay 500 paper marks for 20 marked gold pieces to provide against collapse. An unprecedented decrease in the German rate of exchange has caused a serious panic among businessmen and the public generally, and has led to enormous prices being paid for gold and silver in coins, which many people seek to purchase now as a sort of an iron reserve which will provide for them when the worst comes. February 14, 1920 French interested in treaty revision, but they would consider none that lightened Germany's burdens. France sees in the possibility of changes opportunity of gains for herself, while the English advocates for alternations would ease the burden of Germany. March 14, 1920 Troops overthrow Ebert, Kapp, Prussian Pan-German, declares himself German Chancellor. Germany today is in the throes of a counter-revolutionary movement which was successful this forenoon in turning the Ebert government out of Berlin and setting up a new administration in the capital. March 28, 1920 German rage rises over Kapp mutiny. People angry over laxity in arresting and prosecuting the revolutionists threaten another strike. Workmen demand that soldiers be withdrawn immediately from the Ruhr district. April 12, 1920 German prices rise though marked gains. Food conditions grow worse and health of people continues to decline. Financial circles in Berlin are recovering their spirits. The mark continues to improve. May 16, 1920 War on profiteers fails in Germany. Prices continue to soar despite Berlin's efforts and rise in marks. Up 6.50%. Since 1914 increase in cost of necessities about 17%. In first 2 months of 1920. June 20th, 1920 Germans welcome steel price drop with the announcement of an actual reduction in the producers' prices for steel and iron, effective from June 1st, and the further statement that there would be no rise in the price of coal. The German press, in general, took occasion to rejoice over this concrete evidence of the fact that the peak of high prices had been reached in these basic industries. June 23, 1920 German food outlook. Crops not up to expectations and farm labor threatens strike. Food riots reported.
はい、こんにちは。フレンチです。今日はリセットボタンというですね、電子書籍の方を出版させていただきました。はい。で、Amazon と、楽天のコボですね、の方で、買っていただいて読めますので、ぜひこの機会にですね、読んでいただければと思います。はい。で、すべてはマシーンという、サブタイトルがついてるんですけども、この言葉はですね、レイダリオさんっていうですね、アンソニー・ロビンズさんの経済だったり、投資家の中のですね、部分のメンターって言われてる方で、この史上最高をですね、稼がせるリーダーとして、ご紹介されてる方なんですけども、ウォーレン・バフェットだったりとか、アマゾンのジョフ・ベゾスだったりとか、ビル・ゲイツだったりとかいると思うんですけど、またちょっとタイプがちょっと若干違いまして、史上最高の稼がせるリーダーっていう部分で、投資家の方の言葉なんですね。で、これからAI だったりロボットだったりとか、本当にテクノロジーの部分でいろんなものがですね、急速に進んでいくと思うんですけども、その中の変化の中での、考え方だったりとか、未来予測的な部分だったりとか、様々なものをですね、 私の方で、書かせていただいている内容になってます。で、この今シリーズ第1作目になりますので、一応もう2作目ができていて、3作目を今書いてるんですけども、ちょっと出版はもうちょっと時間がかかるかと思うんですけども、ぜひですね、この機会にリセットボタンということで検索していただくか、もしくはリンクの方からですね、すぐに読めますので、よかったらぜひこの機会に買ってください。はい、よろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。はい。で、第1回目はですね、リセットがなぜ必要かっていうことだったり、脳のお話だったり、これからAI ロボットだったりとか、そういった部分のお話になってました。で、第2巻、今回もですね、今すぐリセットが必要な方だったりとか、今後どうなっていくのかっていうことも含めてですね、書いてあります。そして私の方のメッセージの方も、書いてありますのでですね、ぜひそちらの方も読んでいただきたいなと思います。そして YouTube の方で約10分間、内容の方ですね、読んでるのがありますので、よかったらそちらの方もご覧いただければなと思います。はい。ぜひよろしくお願いいたします。はい。ありがとうございました。Thank you. シェシェ